Thank you, and thank you, Simon, and thank you all for coming. You know, you spent a couple of years writing a book and you throw it out there and you have no idea whether anyone will listen or read it. And so it's great to have a group of more than 2 or 3 of my friends in my living room listening to what I think is happening in the world. Everybody in every era thinks they live in an era of change, that there are unique things about their time, and there probably are unique things about any time. But in this particular period, we can identify 3 really singular shifts occurring, a really global scale, sufficiently deep and sufficiently broad to affect the paths of the world's major nations over the next 10 to 15 years. Beyond that, we really don't know what's going to happen. Technology changes, politics changes, changes accumulate. But these 3 phenomena are so large and so deep that we can trace with some real certainty some of their impacts. And I want to describe the 3 of them briefly, and then we can talk about any aspect of them that interests you. The first is demography, the aging of nations. There is not one instance in our historical records of a single society having an unusually large generation followed by an unusually small generation. Cases of unusually small generations usually because of plagues or wars, but never that particular combination in one instance. We're now seeing it on a global scale. It's happening in virtually every society outside of the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa. And it has enormous economic and political implications. The economic implications arise significantly from the fact that, from 2 facts. One is that saving behavior is age-specific. People tend to save from their mid-30s to their mid-50s. Normally, this is not a problem because generations get bigger. But when you hit this kind of situation in which you have a generation that is contracting and that cohort contracts, it means the saving rate contracts. As the saving rate contracts, investment rates contract unless you're a society that can attract savings from everywhere else in the world. Japan is on the cutting edge of demographic change, that is the aging. And I remember when Japan was thought of as a high saving society. It was a high saving society. In the last 20 years, the saving rate of Japan has fallen from 25% to 5%. This is also beginning to occur across Europe. The other major economic effect is that economic growth is the sum of improvements in productivity and expansions in the labor force. And what we're beginning to see across Europe and in Japan, and there again on the cutting edge, is contractions in the labor force. The Japanese labor force today is contracting at an average annual rate of 1% a year. The number of elderly people are increasing at a rate of 3% a year. The same thing will begin in France around 2012 and in Germany around 2015. And this creates not only severe pressures on growth, and even the OECD projects that the average growth rate for Germany and France from 2010 to 2020 will be between 1.5% and 2% a year. I think that's optimistic, actually. But of course, it also then creates enormous political pressures because older people receive the majority of the social supports in all advanced societies. And in particular, it's not only its pensions and its health care, and in health care in particular, we have a convergence of the fact that the most common and expensive conditions, which are heart disease and cancers, are highly concentrated in people age 60 and above. Again, this is much less of a problem when the generation succeeding it is larger than that generation, but we have that reversal now. And it's going to cause some enormous political stresses, particularly in Europe and in the United States as well over the next 10 years. The second force, the second large shift that we see is happening in geopolitics. For more than 1,000 years, geopolitics has been defined by various forms of balances of power. Often you would have one nation that was more powerful than other nations, but in every other instance before the current period, there were near peers who could constrain the discretion of the largest power. This is an anomalous time in geopolitical history. Most of our the lives of everybody here was defined by the great balance of power between the Soviet Union and the United States. We had this singular phenomenon of the collapse from within, in the absence of a war, of one of the great superpowers, leaving only one. After a time in which all the countries which had been the great powers of the world for the preceding 200 years had outsourced their security to the United States. And when that occurred, the United States, our country, the sole superpower, intensified its investment in national security assets, while the rest of the world continued to decrease it, so that today the United States not only spends more on defense than the rest of the world combined, and more on R&D, defense R&D, than any single nation spends on other nation on any other defense, is the guarantor of the sea lanes and the air lanes through which all oil and trade occurs. And there are the first implication of this new configuration in geopolitics is that the entire world becomes the interest of the sole superpower, in part because there's no external power to constrain it. And we see this not only in the Bush administration, we saw it in the Clinton administration, where the Clinton administration acted into local and regional conflicts and situations in virtually every continent in the world, and acted indeed as a sole superpower. There are a lot of implications of this, but one that's most relevant, I suppose, is that even though we have learned that a sole superpower is not necessarily competent, not necessarily wise in the way they exercise that power, a sole superpower has no alternative but to exercise its power and influence. And indeed, the rest of the world depends on it, because there is no other nation which can project forces around the world when regional conflicts threaten the interests of the rest of the world, most notably in the Middle East, but not only in the Middle East, in Pakistan and the potential conflict between Pakistan and India, in the heart of Europe, which we saw in Bosnia and Kosovo. So that this role, at least for the next 10 to 15 years, of the United States as either a competent or not competent guarantor of global stability has been built into the global system and to all of our futures. And the third force is economic globalization. Now, as an economist, this is the one which I naturally kind of recur to, I suppose. But it is really quite remarkable. First, there is the dimension. In 1990, 18% of all the goods and services produced in the world were traded across borders. Last year, it was 30%. We have never seen an increase of those dimensions before. Moreover, this is not the old international trade of the last several hundred years writ larger, but a quite different phenomenon. And it's driven largely by technological change. First, by the ability to radically deconstruct the manufacturing process so that whatever you're making can now be broken down into 40 or 50 different processes, and each of those distributed in the place where it can be done most efficiently and effectively. And then knit together through advances in information technologies to create global networks. And so that the traditional pattern of trade in which advanced economies would buy commodities from developing economies and then bring those commodities back, produce them into something at home which they would then mainly sell to other advanced economies, which was the basic pattern of international trade for several hundred years, is entirely different now. The production is distributed across the world, and with the growth of developing markets is now sold around the world. So that the significance of this globalization is entirely different. And in this new system, we're seeing the emergence of really two poles of globalization. And the two poles are really the United States and China. China has become, because both of the size of its potential market and its supply of cheap labor and cheap real estate and tax incentives, is becoming the production and assembly platform for basic commodities for the entire world. And it will spread beyond China over the next 10 to 15 years to other countries like Bangladesh and Indonesia and perhaps India. And this really arose from China's decision to pursue an entirely different model of modernization than any other country has ever pursued before. In the past, every country, the United States, the European societies, India, modernized basically through the model of what economists call import substitution. You build protectionist walls to allow your own industries to develop protected from foreign competition until they're strong enough so they can go out into the world and compete with more advanced economies. China tried an entirely different model, and a model which could only occur in an era of globalization, could only occur in an era in which sophisticated manufacturing processes and advanced business organizations could be transferred anywhere in the world. Instead of building walls, she tore them down and invited the world's advanced nations and their most advanced corporations to move entire business organizations to China. And the result is that China has become created an export tsunami. Her exports grew from $65 billion in 1995 to $800 billion last year. One of the results of that is that it's overwhelming the exports of many other developing nations and driving, in an interesting way, accelerated modernization in other developing countries, as other countries like Thailand and Malaysia and Uruguay and Egypt, try to get out of the way of Chinese competition. And the way they get out of that competition in particular is they try to move up the value chain a little. And in so doing, they advance the modernization of their own economies. But in the process, they then put more competitive pressure on economies that had been one step above the value chain from them before. Industry by industry, this is occurring. And the result has been a singular intensification in competition around the world. And the way we can recognize that is that corporations have seen their pricing leverage reduced. Their ability to raise their prices has been reduced. And that's the primary reason why global inflation has been historically low for the last 10 years. Well, this is now posing a new and unexpected problem for the United States and for the world's advanced economies. Because as this globalization process intensifies competition and reduces pricing leverage, more and more US corporations in particular have had to confront certain fast rising fixed costs. in particular, healthcare and energy. The employer-provided healthcare costs have gone up 100% in the last 7 years. On the employee side, it's up 87%. Energy costs, likewise, have more than doubled in that period. Now, what do corporations do? What do businesses do when certain fixed costs rise very fast and intense competition makes it very difficult to pass on those additional costs in higher prices? They cut other costs. And the costs they have been cutting are wages and jobs. And so we are seeing now in the US economy an historic decoupling of the traditional relationships between how fast an economy grows and how many jobs it creates, and how much productivity increases and how much wages rise. The Bush administration says it's very proud of having created between 5 and 6 million jobs in the last 6 years. In the 8 years of the Clinton administration, we created 22 million jobs. Following the 1990 and 1980 recessions, it took 18 months to return to pre-recession job levels. This time it took 52 months. In the 1990s, productivity rose an average annual rate of about 2.5% a year, and the median wage rose 2.2% a year. This is the way free labor markets work. As workers become more productive, their wages get bid up. Nothing has happened to change the freedom of US labor markets. But productivity in the last 5 years has risen at an average annual rate of 3% a year, the best record since the 1960s. And the median wage, which covers 75% of the workforce, that is everyone who's not a manager or a professional, has stagnated. This is creating a new set of structural problems for the US economy, even as the United States has become really the advanced economy that thrives most in globalization. We are the most globalized advanced economy in the world. 44% of our exports go to developing nations. 50% of our imports come from developing nations, and 27% of our foreign direct investment is in developing nations. The three major economies of Europe, Germany, France, and Britain, 20% of their imports come from developing nations, as opposed to 50 for us. About 16% of their exports go to developing nations, again, as opposed to 44% for us. And 9% of their foreign direct investment is in the developing world. The European economies trade and invest almost exclusively with themselves and with the United States. The United States has globalized with the globalization of the overall economy, which is why our growth rate and our productivity rate has far outpaced any other advanced economy. For the overall economy, this has been a very positive development. Moreover, the United States, globalization changes the role of advanced economies in the global economy, with China and other developing nations becoming the production and assembly platform. The role of advanced nations is to develop the new ideas, the new products and processes and materials, new ways of financing and marketing and distributing goods, new ways of organizing a workplace and running a business. This again is a strength of the American economy because, in particular, America, the US economy, is leading other large economies, not some of the smaller advanced economies, but other large economies, in really becoming an idea-based economy. You know, the idea-based economy has been a metaphor for a long time. It's not a metaphor. It's now a concrete reality. We can see in Federal Reserve data for the first time in economic history that corporations in the United States since 1995 invested more in intangible goods than they did in physical assets. That's in patents and copyrights and databases and brands and way of organizing and training their workers. In 1984, the book value of the 150 largest American corporations, that's what you could sell their physical assets for on the open market, was equal to 75% of their market value. Large US corporations were worth a little more than what their physical assets were worth. In 2005, the book value of the 150 largest US corporations was equal to 36% of their market value. 2/3 of the value of large US corporations now lies in their intangible assets. That is the concrete reality of an idea-based economy. The challenge for the next president, the challenge for progressives, is to fashion a series of policies and responses that first of all can reconnect the traditional relationship between how fast the economy grows and how many jobs it creates, and the traditional link between how much productivity rises and how much wages rise, or else we will consign 3/4 of the American workforce at least to no prospect of upward mobility, and produce a kind of politics much closer to a European model, I suspect, than the American model. And the other is to, and this is part of that process, is to ensure that every American worker can operate effectively in an idea-based economy. In 10 years, there will be no jobs in the United States that do not require an ability to function effectively in a work environment suffused with information technologies, whether it's a construction worker who will hold a handheld computer that will direct him or her on what rivets to next drive in and the job after that, or a truck driver who will always be operating off of fairly sophisticated on-cab computers. 50% of American workers today can't operate a computer, can't operate on the internet. So we have a series of new challenges that are both demographic, and even though the demographic problem in the United States is less than in Europe, almost exclusively because of immigration, we still face the same healthcare financing crisis that the Europeans and Japanese will face. We face an enormous challenge in managing the assets of a sole superpower in a wise way and a competent way, and rebuilding global coalitions to advance the interests that the sole superpower frankly defines, which was the model of the Clinton administration. And perhaps most difficult of all, adjust to these new and historic changes in economic dynamics brought about by an historic process of globalization that will define our economic lives and the lives of our children for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Thank you very much.